All right. So we left off last class talking about kind of taxes, tax incidents, or who bears more of the burden of a tax. I'll kind of finish a little bit of discussion there. We'll think about calculating surpluses for taxes a little bit more, and then we'll kind of jump into some other things the government can do. We could finish that up. So next week, I probably won't post a new version of the slides. Whatever we don't finish on these slides, we'll just finish on Monday. Wednesday's class will be review, and then we have the exam a week from today in class. Okay? Got those practice problems, or essentially practice exam problems up there. They're kind of in two different categories. So problem set 1 and 2. I also put up some detailed answer keys. So basically, like I can just show you here. We should have enough time today, I think. So in that practice problems folder, I put up some detailed answer keys so you can kind of see what this looks like. I put sample quiz. I should probably rephrase those. They're just practice problems. But kind of notice it's how you would work out to get that correct answer. So I've got those up there as well for both of those. So, you know, just because you know what the answer is, A, B, C, or D, doesn't mean you can necessarily get, reproduce that. Those should kind of help you be able to understand why the answer is what it is. Okay. And then we have that homework assignment, which is due at the end of the day on Monday. So hopefully after Monday, should then use the rest of the week to kind of prepare for that exam next Friday. Any questions before we get going here? All right, so there's something else that I forgot to do before I started class here, because I do want to use these today, at least a little bit, give you guys some credit for being here. So anyways, I'll kind of talk as I'm getting this pulled up, but we talked about tax incidents, who bears more of the burden. I gave you an example where if we had perfectly inelastic demand, we said that consumers would bear the entire burden. So we'll kind of get a refresher of what that looked like, right? So we said one way we could do it is just compare the elasticities, right? Whatever elasticity is less, right, or lower, or whoever is more inelastic, right? We said they're going to bear more of the burden. So if elasticity is lower, that means they're more inelastic. Those individuals will bear more of the burden, consumers versus producers. We said, okay, think about a perfectly inelastic demand curve. What ends up happening? Well, the entire tax revenue was what used to be consumer surplus, right? Notice the consumers pay a higher price after the tax, but sellers keep the exact same price. So I had a slide up there, using it from another class, and it didn't really kind of apply. So I got rid of it. I re-uploaded the skeleton slides, and it won't be in the kind of final version. But I wanted to give an idea about, okay, what if we had supply be perfectly inelastic? And it's a little bit more difficult to think about. So we've got a regular demand curve, right? And we have perfectly inelastic supply. So we know that if we allow this market to be in equilibrium, we should be kind of starting out something like this. Now, this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Hopefully, consumer surplus is easy for us to identify. It's just going to be the difference between how much consumers benefit, which we recall, that's what the demand curve tells us. So the difference between their additional benefit and their additional cost. What is the additional cost to consumers? Whatever that equilibrium price was. So we can kind of think about the difference between that demand curve and the equilibrium price would be consumer surplus. Producer surplus gets weird here. So if you think about what's the marginal cost, right, to producers, it's really, if we had a perfectly inelastic demand curve, it's odd because technically our supply curve, if it's perfectly inelastic, means that we're never going to produce these quantities. We're only going to produce this quantity, and we'll produce that quantity no matter what the price. There isn't a very practical example for this. I'm just using this as an extreme example to understand kind of who's going to bear more of the burden. Okay? So in this weird scenario, right, and actually there is one situation that applies to this, and it's a little bit of a shameless plug for me. Okay? So I teach a sports econ course. So if you're interested in taking that, the prerequisite is
201, but also 221, so we get a little bit more into some of the statistics. So you couldn't take it next semester, but maybe next year. And a really good application is going to be anything where we see tickets, right? So anytime we have an arena or a stadium, essentially, I have to have the same number of seats in my stadium once it's built, right? So I've always got kind of this fixed quantity. So there are some situations where we can apply this, but it's more so using it as an extreme case to understand if we did have perfectly inelastic producers, who would bear more of the burden. So if this was a scenario, really their marginal cost is actually zero. Right? So the marginal benefit to producers would be the price. So before the tax, we kind of have this entire area being total surplus. We've got some of it being consumer, some of it being producer surplus. Okay. After the tax, right, what's going to happen is that essentially, when we think about marginal cost, supply representing marginal cost. Well, really at this quantity, what's the marginal cost? Well, it could be here, actually kind of infinite. And this is kind of a weird thing. I wouldn't expect, this is a little bit in math, but if I add a number to infinity, I still have infinity, right? So with the tax, it's really weird because suppliers are perfectly inelastic. They're going to keep providing or supplying the same amount no matter what the cost. If I add in additional cost, my supply curve actually doesn't shift. It's a really weird scenario where taxes won't shift my supply curve, and it's only because my suppliers are perfectly inelastic. This additional cost, they're not responding to it at all. So in not responding to it, what ends up happening, they provide the same amount to the market, the equilibrium price is still the same. And actually, I'll use red to kind of notate what happens after the tax. So the price is exactly the same, but remember, the equilibrium price, or the price that consumers pay, that's not what the sellers get to keep, right? So the price that's charged for this good stays the same, but how much do the sellers keep? Would be this much, kind of, minus whatever. So, right, the difference between the price the consumers pay and the price the seller keeps would just be the value of the tax. Now, if the government was smart, so let's say they impose this tax, what ends up happening? Consumer surplus remains unchanged. Producer surplus is only down here, and this entire area in the middle now becomes tax revenue, right? The value of the tax times the number of units sold after the tax, which, because suppliers are perfectly inelastic, didn't change. So we get this really weird scenario where when suppliers are perfectly inelastic, they're going to bear the entire burden. All of tax revenue comes from producer surplus. Now, I wouldn't expect you to reproduce this, and I'm not going to necessarily ask you questions on this because it is a very weird scenario, but it highlights the fact that whoever is more inelastic is going to bear more of the burden. In fact, if I'm completely inelastic, I'll bear the entire burden. Now, if I was the government here, what would it be smart to do? So I could set a tax like this, or I can make sure that the tax just pushed them down to this 0 point. Well, like I said, these aren't really, we don't see this in practice, but if we did have some weird scenario like that, and I don't know, the government comes in and wants to tax stadiums and things like that, we could see them extract quite a bit of surplus from them. Any questions on that? Just another way of thinking about this. So let's think if we have a more practical scenario where we have a demand and supply curve that aren't perfectly inelastic. So how would I calculate kind of consumer producer surplus before and after taxes? This is just going to hopefully be kind of a refresher of how we calculate these surpluses. They're generally just the area of either a triangle or rectangle, so you can kind of think about what it's going to look like. So before the tax here, right, and I don't have the line, but kind of assume that after the tax, it would kind of hit that demand curve up here, but we're going to hold off on that for a second, because before we think about that, we just want to know what's going to exist without the tax. So without the tax, my equilibrium quantity is 40, my equilibrium price is 50, that's the point where my supply and demand curve intersect. What would my consumer surplus be? How would I calculate it? Well, what do I want? I want the area of this triangle. What's the base of that triangle? Sounds pretty easy. It goes from 0 to 40, so the base is 40. What's the height of that triangle? It goes from 50 to 90, so the difference between those two values, 40. So I want to find the area of the triangle. Hopefully, going into the exam, this burn in your mind, it's just 1/2 times the base times the height. So 40 times 0.5. Sorry, I have my animation too early, so ignore that for a second. Ignore the colors for a second. Right, but we've got kind of starting consumer surplus of 80. Then after, right, we have this imposed tax. So the supply curve shifts up here. The new equilibrium price consumers pay is 60. Well, now consumer surplus, we don't use the old equilibrium price, we use the new price that consumers pay after the tax of 60. So now we're just finding this blue area, right? Now it's the difference between the marginal benefit consumers or the demand curve and the new price they're paying of 60. So now the base of our triangle only goes out to 30. The height of our triangle, well, it goes from 60 to 90. So it's also 30. I kept these numbers kind of nice and easy. So 30 times 1/2, we can see that consumer surplus is falling. So before, consumer surplus would have been this entire triangle, right? When we had this market equilibrium. After the tax is imposed and consumers now pay this higher price, we see a slight decline in consumer surplus. But I think about what was producer surplus before. Well, that would have been the entire triangle here. The base would be 40. It goes from what, 10 to 50. So the height was 40 as well. And I kept this nice and easy, 40 times 1/2. Whoops. Producer surplus started out exactly the same as consumer surplus. Now, this is not always going to be the case. I just kind of kept the same here to make the point of who's going to bear more of the burden. Well, we have similar surplus values before. Afterwards, right, the new price sellers keep is 40. So now this triangle, 30 is the base, 30 is the height, 1/2 times 30 times 30. We have the exact same kind of decrease in surplus. So here, what would have to be true about the elasticities for supply and demand? I think someone said it. Not necessarily inelastic, right? We don't actually know if so you're thinking you're close, right? But it don't necessarily have to be unit elastic for them to have the same. So what you're probably noticing is consumers in surplus lost the exact same amount, right? So consumers lost what? 350, producers also lost $350 in surplus. Because they lost the same amount, they don't necessarily have to be unit elastic. But what has to be true is that the elasticity of demand would be equal to the elasticity of supply. Whatever their elasticity is, it's the same. Now they could both be unit elastic. We would actually have to calculate given the quantity, the movement between these two prices and the quantity to see exactly what the elasticity was. But for them to bear the same burden, all we have to have is that they have the same elasticity. In fact, they could both be inelastic and they both could be elastic. As long as they're the same, they'll bear the same amount of the burden. Now, the amount of that burden will depend on how elastic they were, how responsive were they to this tax or this price change. So here, what would my tax revenue be? Remember, 60 was the price that consumers are now paying after the tax. 40 is the price that sellers would keep. So the value of my tax should be just the value of the tax, not the tax revenue. 20. All right. The difference between the price consumers pay and the price sellers keep is 20. Now, I want the total tax revenue, right? How much money was made from that $20 tax? Well, I'll take that $20 tax and multiply it by how many units were sold after the tax. So 20 times 30, 600, as I heard a couple people say. So the reason why we knew the value of the tax is 20.
I did have a 30.
Yep. So the price consumers pay is 60. The price the sellers were keeping was 40. The difference between those two is just whatever the tax was, whatever, amount the producers. I give them $60, well, they already paid 20 to the government. Right, so the amount that they actually keep in net is whatever I paid my tax. So, our tax revenue. What would deadweight loss be? I'm just calculating the area of this little red triangle. But why? Well, because deadweight loss is how much surplus that before all this happened, what was total surplus? Well, when we're in equilibrium, it was just the difference between my supply and my demand curve. For total surplus, right? It was composed of two things, consumer and producer, but total surplus was just that entire. Deadweight loss is how much surplus did we lose out on after this tax is imposed? Well, after the tax is imposed, we sold 10 fewer units. So all the surplus that was made before on those 10 units, we're going to lose out on. We're no longer selling, right? So what was the surplus that was gained from those 10 units we're no longer selling? Just the difference between the supply and demand curve, right? Or that little red triangle. I guess it's a non-technical way to kind of remember that. And then we're just looking for the height of that triangle, which in these tax examples, when you're calculating deadweight loss, the height of that triangle is always going to be visually what? The value of the tax. And then the base of your triangle will basically be how many fewer units did I sell? Here, we sold 10 fewer units. So 20 times 10 times 0.5 will give us that value of deadweight loss. Questions here before we keep moving? I might ask you guys to do a few, okay?
So, let's see. I'll get this started and then I'll kind of set this up for you to hopefully.
So let's say you have a $25 tax imposed, and you want to calculate what the consumer surplus after this tax. So here was the old supply curve, the new supply curve plus the tax. If I were to draw it on there, kind of go out here, and it would intersect my demand curve at this value set. So the new supply curve plus the tax is going to hit my demand curve at this point of 70, resulting in the new equilibrium quantity being 35. And giving you those in case it's hard to see on this graph, right? So given that information, and then you may not need it for this problem, but the point that we'd be at on the supply curve here, this is 45. So it hits the demand curve at 70 for producers, it hits the supply curve at 45, and our new equilibrium quantity is 35. So after that tax is imposed, what would the value of consumer surplus be? So give you a little bit of time to work on this, talk to the people around you. It's meant to be kind of times for you to start working on problems that I could show you on the exam. Yeah.
The base is 35, and then the height is 20. Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
And then just divide that.
All right. I'm gonna leave this one open. So, I want to change your mind at any point. Feel free. So before we get to this question, I heard you guys talk, hopefully talking about it. Sound like we're talking about the problem. How would I calculate consumer surplus before the tax? You do
30 times 50.
Yeah, so why 30 times 50?
So 60 to 90 is 30.
Yep, we were actually looking for the entire triangle here when we were in equilibrium. So the base, we were going out to 50, and the height of that triangle, we were going from 60 to 90. So if it helps, right, you can think about it as really what I did there is that, right? So what, 1,500 divided by 2, 750. What would producer surplus be? So I'm making a point after we get through some of these. Well, that's the entire triangle here. So what? The height goes from 60 to 10, so 50. And then we went out to that quantity of 50 times 1/2. So 1,250. So initially, producer surplus was a little bit higher than consumer surplus in this situation. Which could happen. I was giving you examples where they're the same before. So now, after the tax is imposed, now how do I find consumer surplus?
You go from 7, you take 70, or you take 90 and you subtract it from 70.
Yeah, right. So I'll go to where, what's the new price my consumers are paying? Said that after the tax would be 70. So now the difference between the demand curve and the price consumers pay is just this little triangle up here. The height, it goes from 90 to 70, so it's 20, and then the units goes out to 35. So what? And then what did I forget to do? Yeah, there we go. So 700 divided by 2. New consumers, consumer surplus is 350. So hopefully everybody gets this one correct.
Can you go through and grab the producer surplus and
Here?
Yeah, how you got the 60 minus 10?
Yeah, so remember, producer surplus is going to be the difference between the benefit producers minus their costs. Well, their costs are reflected in the supply curve, and the benefit to the benefit to producers is whatever the price is. Well, before the tax, our equilibrium price was 60. So here would be producer surplus. What's the height of that triangle? Well, it's going from 10 to 60. All right, so that height, that's why I was doing that. And then multiply by the base, well, it's going out to that equilibrium quantity of 50, and then times 1/2 to triangle. Does that help? Any other questions? We'll keep moving. I'm gonna close this out, so hopefully everybody got their answer in. I am afraid to check this. Okay, awesome. Everyone's paying attention today. All right, so what if, gosh, somewhere. Anyway, so let's say I want instead to find producer surplus after this tax. So I won't be as friendly on this one. I'll actually make you kind of answer before we work through it, but I'll give you a couple minutes. Hopefully this shouldn't be too bad. This is a reminder. You can't quite see an online, but at this point here would be 45. Did I say that? Yeah, okay. Well, sometimes when I'm looking like this way, I can flip things around, so. Oh, yeah, right, yeah, you're right here.
There you go on the base of it, which is 35, and then base of height is 25.
See, that's one I didn't even.
This is an average.
So you do that to 34.
Very
All right. If you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. I think we're missing a few. Only got 33, 35 of you. Make sure you're getting a response in. Thought we had 37 before. All right. All right. All right, I'm gonna close it out. Okay. So
How am I gonna find producer surplus after this tax?
1935, 175, something like that.
Yeah, so what area is it gonna be? Well, the new price that sellers keep was whatever the price consumers pay minus the value of the tax. Now, notice I told you the tax was 25 here. If I gave you this on the exam, you could tell me the price of the tax is 25 because the difference between the price consumers paid of 70 and the price sellers keep was 45. So here I'm looking for the area below the new price sellers keep because that's their benefit. The difference between that and their supply curve. So it goes from what, 10 to 45, so the height's 35. So without this new equilibrium quantity, I shouldn't call it equilibrium quantity, it's a quantity after the tax of 35 as well. So 35, actually if I write, we found that 35 first, like 45 minus 10 times 35 times a half, what, 1225, so 612.5. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? So, we look at this, kind of how much the consumers, yes, I'll call this, consumers and producers. How much did the consumers lose here? Well, surplus fell by 400, so lost 400 then. Producers lost what? 637.5, if I'm doing the math in my head correct here. So who was more elastic? Or you could also, I guess, phrase it the other way, because I think it's a little easier to think about. Who was more inelastic here? Yeah, who lost more surplus? They were less responsive. They were more inelastic, right? Here we would have producers kind of being more inelastic. And we know that because they lost more surplus. Okay. Questions on that? We keep moving. Not too bad, I don't think. I think I won't use this one as a clicker. Hopefully this is pretty easy. What would tax revenue be here? Well, if the new equilibrium quantity is 35, the value of the tax was 25. I'm really just looking for the area of that rectangle here, or 25 times 35, no half, right? Because it's not a triangle. I'm just the number of units sold times the value of the tax. So 25 times 35, I should get that 875. Just to kind of be clear, how was I coming up with what tax revenue was there? Maybe you can think about a more general form, like even if you don't have the graph, you kind of already can identify these things. So you're going to take the value of the tax, then you're going to multiply the quantity after the tax. From there, we could see, the value of the tax is 25, and our new quantity after the tax was 35. Okay. And that's how we were reproducing that value. Is that pretty clear? That one should be pretty easy. I think the surplus ones are a little bit tougher. You got to remember the half. You have to look for heights. Kind of there. Dead weight loss would just be what here? That little triangle right here. Yeah, so it's going to be that little triangle, right? For all these units that we're no longer selling, we lost all of this surplus. So yeah, so we've got the height of that triangle is what? 70 minus 30? No, 70 minus 45. Or what should this be? the value of the tax. I always said that kind of that deadweight loss, the height of our triangle will always be our value of our tax. And then the next thing we're gonna multiply by is the base. We went from 50 to 35, or basically the units that we lost because of this tax, right? So we're selling 15 fewer units, and then I'm gonna have the area of the triangle, so we can make sure we multiply it by half. So what? Never mind. You sure? So you got what, 15 times 25 times a half? I can't do that math as easily in my head, so I actually there real quick, okay? Questions on that? So, kind of finish up taxes here, and then I will jump into some other stuff the government can do. So, let's say we have a small tax, right? So the government's taxing different goods. Really what it wants is it wants goods, tax goods that are inelastic, right? Because if people aren't responding to that tax change, then the government can take a lot of what used to be produced in consumer surplus and turn it into tax revenue. So if you think about like a small tax, you can kind of think about how much revenue we're going to generate. So here's my small tax. Here's my kind of tax revenue that we lost, right? So the government, they want to raise tax revenue, but I can't just put like ridiculously high taxes, because as I increase the value of the tax, what happens to that equilibrium quantity? Well, I'm pushing the price up, and so people are going to buy way less, right? And I'm going to get these losses to society, right? Now, I guess in a more historical, practical sense, like if those deadweight losses get too large, my populace might revolt, right? We saw it, right? The Boston Tea Party is a perfect example, right? Britain was raising these taxes, and eventually, yeah, you can generate a lot of tax revenue, but if you start eating into consumer and producer surplus too much, your populace is going to get pretty mad, right? So you could impose these higher taxes, right? I said moderate tax, higher than the small tax. You kind of notice, like, I'm still generating out a lot of tax revenue, but my deadweight loss is increasing. And then I can kind of think about, maybe a really large tax. At some point, if I increase it too much, well, people just stop buying the good, and they're actually like, I'm not generating that much tax revenue from this huge tax, right? And I'm causing huge loss to society. So what's better? Probably kind of to live in that moderate range. I'm usually maximizing my tax revenue with the moderate tax, and I'm not, causing too much loss on this market for people to get too upset. That's a little bit of a subjective thing, I guess. You can calculate what these values are for different goods and exactly what the tax revenue would be for different goods. It's all going to depend on the elasticity. So, just to kind of summarize things that we talked about, right? It doesn't matter if we tax consumers or producers. I showed you an example where you can draw this as though when you tax consumers, it decreases demand, and we see the exact same effects. Now, when you're working through these and you're drawing this out, I would always highly suggest just drawing it as though it's a tax on producers and suppliers. It just makes intuitively more sense. But it doesn't matter. Whoever bears more of the burden will be who is ever more inelastic, right? Or whoever is more elastic can avoid the burden. What's the last one? So if we have inelastic demand, we can generate a lot of tax revenue, right? Because people aren't being very responsive. And then the deadweight loss is going to be larger when demand and supply are less. I won't necessarily, don't worry about this last one. But the idea is that if people are very responsive to these price changes, as soon as I impose a tax, they buy way less of it or produce way less of it. So that would cause really large deadweight losses. I'm not going to necessarily ask you to have an exam, but that would be a byproduct of all the things that we've talked about up to this point. And then deadweight loss and tax revenue are kind of, we just kind of looked at some different sides of the tax. There's like a trade-off between the two. I can generate more tax revenue, but that's going to come at a cost of eating into or kind of increasing deadweight loss or eating into total surplus in that market. So I'm not going to quiz you anything, but these are some of the implications. We then have kind of an interesting case study, I guess. But right, in terms of the tax, we want to increase tax revenue, but sometimes it's not just increased tax revenue. Sometimes we tax things because we want people to stop doing it. So what do you think are very popular, like if we see goods that are heavily taxed, cigarettes, alcohol, now in states where it's legalized, marijuana has very high taxes, right? So sometimes it's not that they want to generate tax revenue. Sometimes the goal of the government is they actually just want to decrease the quantity, right? Because one of the implications of what we've been doing, we said, when I impose this tax, we're always getting the new equilibrium quantity is lower, right? So that's good. If I don't want people to smoke, I just start taxing tobacco products and I see less of it being produced. Now, what's the issue? I could go back and argue, like for cigarettes, I gotta go way back here. For cigarettes, what if someone is perfectly inelastic? Like they have no desire to quit, they're not going to quit, they want to keep smoking, they need to keep smoking, they're perfectly inelastic. Well, then if my goal as a government, by imposing this tax is to reduce quantity, if it's a very inelastic good, I can't reduce the quantity much at all. In fact, if it's perfectly inelastic, I'm not going to reduce quantity much at all. So, you know, the government is maybe me being a little bit cynical, but they might say that they want to decrease the quantity of kind of tobacco products purchased by imposing a tax, but they know damn well that it's an inelastic good. They know people won't stop buying it. So really what happens if they impose a tax on that good? They're just generating a bunch of tax revenue, right? If people aren't buying that much less, they're just paying for, right? The consumer surplus is being lost, it's going to the government. Wait a second, maybe that's cynical, but I think it's probably accurate. So another kind of interesting example was in Ireland, and they did this, there was a paper written on this, when they did this like really small tax on plastic bags. And you know, the goal was that they wanted to try to reduce kind of how many plastic bags are being used, right? And it worked, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but if I'm, you know, I think I went to last week, I went to Aldi. I don't know how much their plastic bags, but I bought one because it was random. I just went there randomly and I didn't have anything, right? So I bought a bag there. If the price of the bag increased by 15 cents, I mean, I think it was already only like 20 cents, maybe I decided I don't need it, right? Or if you impose a tax of $1, like, then I'm probably definitely going to decide, like, I can just carry these things into my house once I get home, right? And so it's probably that demand is pretty elastic, right, for plastic bags. Sure enough, even a small tax, they saw that plastic bag usage fell a lot, right? Now, one thing that's really interesting, so this one, the government didn't generate that much tax revenue. This might be, you know, maybe Ireland, you know, they're a little bit more, I guess, moral, and you know, they really were trying to just reduce the quantity. They didn't generate a lot of tax revenue. One was really interesting that came out of this, and this is kind of outside the scope of this class, but it's interesting, so I'll talk about it. So plastic bags, like you said, the real thin ones, that's the ones they put a tax on. So like before, you know, maybe they were even free, right? But now I have to pay 15 cents for every bag that I use at Payless or whatever grocery store you're going to. Maybe I don't buy the plastic bags. Maybe what do I do instead? I start kind of buying like a reusable one, right? So this is kind of wild, but you know, like a reusable plastic bag you get like in a grocery store, I don't know, they sell them like everywhere. They're a lot thicker, right? And you wouldn't think about it, but like those other plastic bags are so thin that the amount of plastic used to make one reusable bag is like, I forget the number, but it's a surprising amount of just really thin plastic bags, something like 50, like it's a really high number. So what they found was people stopped buying these like thin plastic bags. They started buying reusable bags, substitute goods, right? They increased the price of these thin plastic bags. People started buying more reusable bags. The problem is these reusable bags don't always get reused, right? And so if someone buys one and then they end up throwing it away, well, I've actually now just caused more pollution than if I would have just let them use 50 of the thin plastic bags. And that's actually what they found in the study, was that the overall amount of plastic usage didn't decrease at all, and it actually increased. And it was because they didn't kind of factor in people were going to buy these reusable bags, which, you know, like I said, Wouldn't think about it, but just like being that much more thick, it's a lot more plastic they had to use to make those. So, all right, cursing, the only bad word is taxes, all right? So hopefully we can see like, this is a bad thing generally for society. Sometimes it's good, we can reduce the quantity used of what we call like sin goods. That's what the government kind of thinks about alcohol, tobacco, gambling, things like that. They impose these high taxes. And like I said, maybe it's because they want to decrease the quantity. It's also a very popular tax to impose, and you can also generate a lot of tax revenue because most sin goods people are generally inelastic. Oh, yeah, pretty good. So I've got quotas here. It's just really, it's the same thing as a tax. If the government comes in and imposes a quota, it's just that instead of adding something to the price, which they then know will have a resulting effect on quantity, they just come in and say, there can't be more than this number of units on the market, right? So they might impose quotas on, companies, so they might not let one company produce more than a certain thing. They might impose quotas on gallons of milk here. And just say you can't produce anything past this point. It won't allow more than this number of units to be kind of put onto the market. Well, in doing so, I'm now choosing the quantity instead of adding to the price. At this new quantity, how much are consumers willing to pay? Well, wherever we're at on that demand curve. So by imposing that quota or that upper level for that quantity, I know that people are willing to pay way more than what sellers than what producers would be marginal costs are. Right? So I know that at the quantity of 400, that producers, they'd be willing to supply that unit if the price is $2. Right? So they're for sure gonna produce 400 units if people are willing to pay $3. So it's well above their marginal cost. Now it has kind of the same implications in terms of the resulting price on the market is $3. Now I put EC and PM here, I guess. I'm trying to compare taxes and quotas, so I don't want to confuse them too much. So I'll just draw a quota example over here, and then I'll kind of use what I have on the slides to make some comparisons of taxes and quotas and the differences between the two. So we got this one here. Supply is marginal cost, demand reflects marginal benefits. And let's say I impose this quota. Well, I know that at this quantity, people are willing to pay wherever we're at on the demand curve at that point. So if all the government does is impose the quota and says nothing about prices, well, then companies know they can no longer charge this lower price. If the amount on the market is limited, it's essentially like they're limiting supply, right? Then companies know they can get away with charging higher prices, right? So the equilibrium price, I guess we'll call this P2 and I'll call this P1, right? Where it's starting, where it's going after the quota. The old equilibrium price, right, is going to be lower than the new price we see in the market. Now that's the price that sellers keep, right? There's not a tax situation, they don't have to pay anything to the government. And so the equilibrium price, I think, increases. And so kind of keep M here. I don't know why I use M for quota, but that was kind of what I was notating that as, right? Quotas will increase the price, and then, right, the whole purpose of a quota is that it's going to reduce quantity. So it has the same effect as taxes, right? Taxes raise the price that we see the goods sold for on the market, and it reduces the quantity. The only difference is that now, where's consumer surplus? Well, it's the difference between price and the demand curve. So consumer surplus is decreased from the equilibrium, which would have been this entire area. But what's producer surplus after this quota? Well, the price that sellers are getting now much higher. Difference between that and their supply curve. We've actually, they lost a little bit of surplus here, producers did, but they gained a lot more than consumers. So by imposing a quota, the reason why we don't see quotas used very often is because, they have the same effects as if I tax the good. If I tax the good, I could raise the price, lower the quantity, and then sellers would keep whatever the consumer paid minus the tax, why might I want to choose a quota though? Or why might I like taxes more than quotas? There's no tax revenue here, right? Quotas don't help the government, but they do help producers, right? Producer surplus increase.
Do quotas and taxes get combined?
You could, but what would be the purpose, right? Because let's say I impose this quota. That's a good question. And then I say, and I'm also gonna put this huge tax. So I'm saying you can't produce more than 300 units. Well, where's the new equilibrium? Right here, okay, right? And my quota is useless because the tax decreased quantity even more than quota, or, you know, you get that vice versa where the tax is, you know. I guess if you want to do a small tax, I wouldn't do this to you guys, but you had a small tax. It should be here, but it's not. So then it puts back to here, but you could then generate like a little bit of tax revenue. So yeah, you could do a combination where you could then still be getting a little bit of tax revenue. But at that point, why use a tax quota? Just use the tax, put it to where you actually want it, and you can generate more tax revenue. I won't combine them two for you guys, quotas, but it is interesting. You could do that in practice. All right, so a little bit tricky, so I might save that for next class. So next class, I'll kind of hold off probably, and we might even look at subsidies until the very end of the class on Monday. We'll do price ceilings and price floors. That'll be the last thing that we cover. Before the exam, so if you're looking at those practice problems, the last few questions might be on price ceilings and price floors, but we'll cover that on Monday. We've actually already looked a little bit at it before. I ended up not putting one up there because I think I mentioned at the very end. I mentioned at the